The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, how smart policy could have saved the Lordstown Plant in Ohio, plus what it would take to end the electoral college, and Bill Press on how to pay for college if you don't have a really wealthy parent. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. When GM closed its Lordstown plant in Ohio, 1,400 workers lost their jobs. Michael Shields says public policy is part of why that happened, and that better policy is needed to protect workers. And we say hello to Michael Shields, researcher with Policy Matters Ohio, and we're here today to discuss the shuttering of General Motors' Lordstown plant. Michael Shields, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Glad to be here.
Our pleasure to have you with us. In your article titled Smart Policy Could Have Saved Lordstown, you write about several policies that might have made a difference. At the federal level, you talk about fuel policy. How could that have made a difference?
Sure. So here I'm really talking about a gas tax. And there are a couple of reasons that we should implement a substantial gas tax. One of them is simply, to price in the actual cost of carbon emissions that we're polluting. But as far as how this could help the automotive industry and specifically General Motors, this is really about predictability. So if the federal government would pass a substantial gas tax, they could actually use that as a tool and vary it so that it would counter gas prices on the market. So when gas prices are high, go ahead and reduce that tax. When gas prices drop down, you raise it up so that you have pretty consistent fuel prices. The reason that's really important is because auto manufacturers are planning for the cars that they're going to be making years out in advance with really limited information about what the cost of fuel is going to be, which is a major factor in consumers' choice of what cars they want to buy. So this would implement predictability into a system that right now is just really a high-stakes gamble.
You also talk about trade policy. How could trade policy better protect workers such as those at Lordstown?
Sure. Yeah, I touch on trade policy. And what I would say is, it's not about saying that we shouldn't trade. Of course, we trade globally and have done and will continue to do so. It's really about rulemaking. We could be using our trade policies to really enhance job quality among our trading partners. Unfortunately, we've really fallen down on the job in that. A lot of our trade policies are really encouraging firms to seek out the cheapest labor that they can globally, and in many ways, that's actually pushing down job quality. So we can actually implement, we could require that our trading partners implement stronger labor laws, like the ones that we have here. When looking at Lordstown, the J.D. Power actually found that that was the most productive plant that General Motors had in North America, and yet we're seeing it shuttered. Excuse me. GM's workers in Mexico are making $3 to $5 an hour. They're going to continue to make the crews there. So we want to be using our trade policies to enhance job quality, including wage protections. We could be supporting higher wages for Mexico. And I think what we want to recognize is, one, we should be concerned about job quality and quality of life for those who are making the things that we buy, wherever they live. But also recognizing that when we implement stronger workforce protections internationally, that's also better for U.S. workers. Again, Lordstown workers are the most productive in North America, and yet we're seeing this plant shuttered.
Just amazing. All right, now let's move to the state level. You mentioned a policy with an interesting name, the Art Modell Law. What is it, and how could that make a difference?
Sure. So this policy was actually named for the former Cleveland Browns owner, Art Modell, who in the 1990s moved the Cleveland Browns to Baltimore, where they became the Ravens. Of course, Ohioans were pretty upset about that. And the state legislature actually passed a law following that event that said, if you want to move a professional sports team, you have to give 6 months notice in advance, and you have to give local people the opportunity to buy the franchise before you pick up and move. That law has actually been used successfully in Ohio. It was used to save the Columbus Crew soccer team. When they announced a possible departure, we were able to retain them in Columbus. And this is something that could actually be expanded out. This is really about valuing jobs and quality jobs as much as we're valuing our professional sports teams, I think. We could expand this law to include any company that gets a state or local government subsidy or a tax incentive.
We're speaking with Michael Shields, researcher with Policy Matters Ohio. And Michael, something else that you touch on is about strengthening WARN Act protections. And for those that don't know, it's a Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. How does the WARN Act protect workers, and how is Ohio following short?
Sure. So Ohio is adhering to the federal policy. Some states are doing more, and Ohio could too. Under the federal law, companies of a certain size have to give notice to their workforce and to the state. They file a notice at least 60 days in advance, notifying that either they'll be shutting down or even if it's not a shutdown in case of a mass layoff. Now, we could actually see a stronger WARN provisions that would include things like smaller companies. Right now in Ohio, if fewer than 50 workers are impacted at one site, the WARN Act doesn't apply. Many states include smaller companies, smaller layoffs. Some states have longer windows of time, and this time span can be really important because sometimes states can actually get involved and prevent companies from closing their doors if they have more notice. And then there are also states that have better protections for workers, things like severance pay and stronger enforcement. Ohio could look to some of those policies.
And what kinds of policies would better support unions in Ohio?
Sure. So right now, Ohio is a free bargaining state. A number of states that neighbor Ohio have passed so-called right-to-work laws. Now, what these laws do is allow people to be represented by a union, if there is a union in their company, without actually paying any dues for that representation. Now, right now, no one is required to belong to a union if you don't want to. But what these so-called right-to-work laws do is allow people to enjoy the benefits of representation from a union, even if they don't belong to it. So things like bargaining for wages, for reasonable scheduling, over working conditions, and also representing people in disputes. Now unions have a fiduciary duty to do that for people, but in some states, people can actually opt out of paying for that. We want to make sure that in order to preserve strong unions in Ohio, Ohio continues to be what's called a free bargaining state, so that when folks are being represented by a union, they're paying their share for that as well. And then the other thing that both the state and local governments can do is to support neutrality. So when workers decide to form a union, sometimes the companies that they work for will try to challenge that. What we can do is give preference in our procurement policies to companies that agree to neutrality in labor organizing. And we could actually also require neutrality in tax incentive packages.
And of course, Michael, as you well know, Donald Trump has taken this on with Lordstown. In one tweet, he complained about the plant closing when, in his words, jobs are booming. What is the president missing here?
Sure. Well, I would say two things. One, so right now the unemployment rate in the U.S. Is very low, as low as it's been in a decade. It's right around 4%. That's not uniform everywhere. It's closer to 7% in the Mahoning Valley, where Lordstown is based. And actually, we've seen a lot of layoffs from this company. 4,500 jobs have been lost from the Lordstown plant alone since 2017. And also companies within the supply chain network have announced closures or layoffs too. We so far have been able to document at least 750 additional jobs. So the unemployment rate is not uniform. It certainly is doing well for the U.S. Not every community is in the same situation. But the other thing that I would say is what the jobs rate doesn't speak to is job quality. Now, workers in Lordstown can make $75,000 a year. Those in the Youngstown Warren region, where Lordstown is based, the typical salary is in the mid 30,000s. So there's a big differential there. And this is actually reflective of a larger trend in Ohio and in the U.S. Now, I don't have a figure for the United States, but in Ohio, among our 10 most common occupations, 6 of those pay too little to support a family of 3 without food assistance. That's 130% of the poverty level is our threshold. Our 10 most common jobs, 6 of them have a family really close to or even at the poverty level. So that's something that we really need to address as well.
Is there any hope that the Lordstown plant could reopen? And if so, what would be the smart way to do that and protect workers and the local economy?
Sure. So I definitely think there's a possibility that Lordstown could reopen. I know that folks in Ohio are not considering this a done deal. And there are a few things going on. One is that the UAW has actually challenged the company's authority to shut down during the scope of the collective bargaining agreement, which is still in force. Now, that only runs till September before renewal. It's not clear what will come from that. But at this point, I think in terms of public policy, the only thing that's left is probably a tax incentive approach. I would say that, first of all, we'd like to see better policies implemented so that we don't land in this situation. Tax incentives as policy can really be, first of all, they're zero sum. They don't add any value to the national economy, and they just sort of pit communities against each other. But what I think that, we probably will see is, some attempt to use incentives to either try to get General Motors to put another car in the Lordstown plant, or possibly to get another company to come and repurpose it in some way. What I would say is that in a tax incentive approach, we would want to see a requirement that the existing contract with UAW be retained. We should see transparency, so notice to the public made in advance and a public comment period. And we should see strong clawbacks as well. Ohio has already earmarked $82 million back in 2006 to help General Motors retool this plant. GM committed at that time to staying in the valley for 30 years. And they reneged on that commitment this month. So we really want to be careful about how we're implementing these policies.
Well, and I was just going to say that the great tax change of this current president, there are a lot of companies that said, it started hiring a little bit more, started giving out a little bit more money, and then all of a sudden they're all closing. Tax incentives don't seem to really be working, especially in a place like Lordstown.
Sure. I think a longer-term policy toward tax incentives would be to avoid them and to seek out non-poaching agreements between communities, because it really sort of turns competition on its head. We want to see companies competing for consumers. We don't want to see communities, cutting back the taxes that they collect from companies to try to compete for companies to come and locate in their communities. This is very costly. It comes out of public services. It comes out of infrastructure, roads, bridges, but also a big loser in tax incentive policy is the schools. So this is very costly, and it's something that we really want to be more purposeful about going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we let you go, what is the impact in Ohio with the plant closing?
Well, I think we still haven't felt the full impact, and we don't know. It's going to be major. There's no question about that. We're talking about 4,500 workers at Lordstown itself. We've identified at least another 750 for direct General Motors suppliers. And I think that this is going to continue to ripple out. The Center for Automotive Research finds that automotive jobs, each direct job is responsible for creating another 6.6 jobs in the economy. So that's what we're losing now, and we're going to also lose that additional effect that these jobs would have. I think we're still going to be feeling this for a long time.
Sobering. Michael Shields, a researcher with Policy Matters Ohio, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Michael, appreciate the work that you're doing. Would love to hear some updates down the road and check in with you. And thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, why it's time to abolish the Electoral College. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Have you noticed how often Donald Trump prefaces his comments and tweets with phrases like, frankly, to tell the truth, and believe me? More than a verbal tick, these qualifiers subliminally admit that being frank, truthful, and believable are not normal for him. So, like a carnival flim-flammer selling snake oil, he strains to convince us rubes that he's not flim-flamming. Among those who are learning about the truthiness of the Donald are farmers who voted for him, having bought his campaign promise to restore farm prosperity. Once in office, though, he quickly sold them out, throwing a hissy fit of a trade war with China that ended up slapping U.S. farmers by lowering the already low prices they get for their crops. Instead of prosperity, the average farm profit last year was minus $1,500. Trying to smooth over this betrayal of the heartland, Trump tweeted out a message to ag producers in December meant to warm their hearts. "Farmers, I love you," he professed. I'm guessing he offered the same sweet insincerity to Stormy Daniels after he, well, you know. Actions speak louder than words, of course, so on March 11th, Trump took actions to express his true love for farmers. He whacked $3.6 billion from the safety net programs that offer a measure of relief to hard-hit producers when crop prices crash. Revealing his plutocratic core, his cuts specifically targeted programs that benefit small farmers, a deliberate manipulation meant to drive more families off the land and increase corporate monopolization of agriculture. This is Jim Hightower saying, not satisfied with intentionally injuring family farmers, Trump added insult by calling the dab of support they get from the government, quote, overly generous. This from a real estate flim-flammer who continues to rake in millions of dollars in government cash and special tax breaks.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. John Koza was so convinced a national popular vote was the best way to elect a president in the United States, he came up with a plan to make it happen. It's called the National Popular Vote legislation. Now he's convinced that enough states will adopt the legislation to make it happen. And we say hello to John Koza, former consulting professor at Stanford University, who co-founded the National Popular Vote Project in 2006. He is lead author of the book, Every Vote Equal, a state-based plan for electing the president by national popular vote, and he's the originator of the National Popular Vote legislation. John Koza, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Well, thank you, Jim, for having me.
And it's certainly our pleasure to be talking with you today. We are talking, in fact, with you at what really seems like a remarkable moment, with national popular vote actually leading some headlines. Are you surprised?
Well, we're not totally surprised because we've been working over a period of a couple of years in each of these states, visiting with legislators one-on-one, and that's what our organization does. We're trying to pass our legislation through the state legislatures in the various states. Naturally, we were surprised that 3 states' legislatures sent our bill to the governor in the same couple-week period, but the fact that things are happening is not a total surprise.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess we should go over some basics. First of all, for those that perhaps have been missing some of these leading headlines, what is the national popular vote, John?
Well, our goal is to have the President of the United States elected by a popular vote of the people in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, so that the candidate who gets the most popular votes nationwide would become president.
Why isn't that? Why is our current system? Well, actually, I should ask you what drove you to commit to this work, but I guess another way to put it is, how does the current system fail us?
Well, there are a lot of shortcomings of the current system, and they flow from state laws that are called winner-take-all laws. And the winner-take-all law in a given state, say in Colorado, says that all 9 of Colorado's electoral votes for president will go to the candidate who gets the most votes inside the state of Colorado. And the effect of these winner-take-all laws, the first effect is that 5 of our 45 presidents have come into office without having gotten the most votes in the country as a whole. But the more insidious and persistent effect that applies every single election is that presidential candidates only pay attention to the states that are, say, between 47 and 53% one way or the other. And if you're in a state that's a little more Democratic or a little more Republican than that, they simply don't campaign there, which means they don't pay attention to issues of concern to those states. And 3 out of 4 states are ignored in the presidential campaign. In 2012, 100% of the general election campaign visits were in just 12 states. In 2016, 94% of visits were in 12 states. And actually about 2/3 of the visits were in just 6 states. So most Americans are really left out of the presidential election, and most states are left out.
Now, there are a few myths that we should dispel. The most pervasive myth, I believe, is that a national popular vote goes against the Constitution. Is that true?
Well, no. The Constitution sets up an electoral college to elect the president, but it's absolutely silent on how the electors in this electoral college are to be selected, and it gives that power to decide exclusively to the states. What the Constitution actually says is each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof shall direct a number of presidential electors, blah, blah, blah. So the Supreme Court has ruled repeatedly that this is an exclusive and plenary power of the states. And the system we have now is was never debated at the Constitutional Convention. It's not in the Constitution. These state winner-take-all laws were never discussed in the Federalist Papers, and only 3 states used them in the first presidential election.
We're speaking with John Koza, who co-founded the National Popular Vote Project in 2006. He's also the lead author of the book, Every Vote Equal, a state-based plan for electing the president by national popular vote. Another myth, John, is that smaller states will lose their vote. How do you respond to that?
Well, the myth, the way you phrase it, actually is the myth. People think the small states have enhanced influence, and they think that because the states do get 2 extra electors corresponding to U.S. senators out of this pool of 538 electoral votes. But the reality is that 12 of the 13 small states for the last 40 years have been one-party states in presidential elections. So candidates don't campaign in the small states, not because they're small, but because they are not competitive. They're not within that 47 to 53% range. Curiously, those 12 small states have the same population as Ohio. The 12 small states have twice as many electoral votes as Ohio. They get absolutely no visits from presidential candidates. They get no attention. Candidates don't care about their issues. Even though they have twice as many electoral votes as Ohio, Ohio gets an enormous amount of attention because it's a razor-thin, closely divided state. So the first thing is small states don't have any influence. But if they did, it wouldn't matter, because the second myth is that there's a lot of people think the small states are Republican. In fact, they're 7-6 Democratic. So they're slightly Democratic or tied, depending on how you want to look at it. But there's no partisan effect of the small states, even if they had any influence in the presidential election.
And there's another myth, and I hope that you can help dispel. The national popular vote is an anti-Republican idea. Is it? And how would that have come to light?
Well, I don't understand it either. If I remember from high school, and since then I've read the Federalist Papers, and a republic is the type of government where the people elect officials to act in their behalf between elections. And the United States is a republic at the moment. Under national popular vote, if the presidential electors are selected in a different way, it will still be a republic, because the president will be elected by the people to serve between elections on behalf of the people. So if you look at the definition of Federalist, of a republic versus a democracy, we are a republic now. We'll continue to be a republic with or without national popular vote. Another point is the governors of 4 of the original 13 states were elected by the people at the time of the Constitutional Convention. And each of those state governments was and still is a republic. Of course, now the governors in all the states are elected by the people, but there's simply no connection between whether the people vote directly for the governor or the president and whether the government is a republic or democracy.
Mm-hmm. Where do you see the greatest resistance to this idea for the national popular vote?
Well, one of the resistances is inertia, because our legislation doesn't take effect until a certain number of states pass it, and that makes it hard to make people feel that it's something that's achievable. But it is achievable when the if and when the governors of these next two states sign the bill that's on their desk, we'll have states with 189 electoral votes. We need 270, so we'll be 81 short. So it is an achievable goal. But aside from inertia, the other problem is whichever political party is currently in office tends to not be so keen on having a national popular vote. So when we started in 2006, it was hard to get Republican legislators to vote for it. But as soon as the 2008 election happened, the first roll call, we got a third of the Republicans. And since then, our bill passed the Oklahoma Senate and the Arizona House. And then we started encountering resistance among Democrats who thought that they were permanently entitled to the White House. So our bill was passed twice by the Republican-controlled New York Senate. We couldn't get it through the Democratic-controlled Assembly. And it didn't finally get through the New York legislature until the day before the November 2016 election.
Well, that's an interesting pattern.
Yes, and of course, after the November 2016 election, suddenly the Democrats have rediscovered the idea that the candidate with the most votes should win, and some of the Republican legislators that were interested in the bill have gotten less interested.
And that certainly does explain why I see more people, my Republican friends, saying that this is an anti-Republican idea over the course of these last couple of years. Now, this, of course, is hardly the first time Americans have questioned the validity of the Electoral College. Are you hopeful that change is actually within reach?
Well, I do think it is within reach. Our legislation would take effect when states having 270 electoral votes pass it, and we will probably be at 189 in the next few weeks. And there's other states actively considering it yet this year, Nevada and Oregon, Maine and Michigan and New Hampshire, and 15 other states where the bill is filed. So we think by 2024 this will be in place.
Well, that would be fantastic, and it would be about time. John Koza, co-founder of the National Popular Vote Project in 2006, lead author of the book Every Vote Equal, a state-based plan for electing the president by national popular vote, joining us today. John, thank you so much for your time with us. We'll have to check back with you down the road and get an update on how things are moving along.
Well, thank you very much, Jim.
Well, we appreciate your time with us. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And we're clear. John, thank you again. Appreciate your time. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with Colleen Campbell, Director of Post-Secondary Education at the Center for American Progress, on the costly state of higher education.
Welcome to our studio here to talk about an important issue that used to get more attention than it does today, but deserves all the attention we can give it, and that is higher education. Colleen Campbell is the Director for Post-Secondary Education at the great Center for American. Nice to see you.
How are you? Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming in. We do want to talk about education, but we've been at it on a lot of other issues for a little bit here. Stirring up a few comments, Peter?
Yes, indeed. We're on Twitter at BP Show, at BP Show.
Has Clarence Thomas spoken again?
Not yet. Not yet today.
Because the court's not in session. Yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah. We've talked for the last couple of days about getting rid of the Electoral College. Elizabeth Warren said in her CNN town hall, it's time to get rid of the Electoral College. Other 2020 candidates have jumped on board. So we asked you in a poll, should we get rid of the Electoral College? Poll just went live about 15 minutes ago. We already have some numbers. 84% of you say yes. 10% of you say no. 6% of you are undecided. A couple of comments on that. Vicky says, change it. Instead of winner take all, like most states, a percentage of the Electoral College is given by the percentage of actual votes.
No, just get rid of it.
Yeah, just get rid of it. I agree with you there. Also, Smacky Pipe says, hopefully we can, as I believe one person, one vote will run in the Democrats' favor more often than not. So yes, that's another vote for yes.
There's a very simple principle here. The person who gets the most votes wins.
Yeah.
This is not complicated.
It's really not that complicated. And John says, you people are living in a fantasy land. You need 2/3 of the Congress, 2/3 of the state legislature, 2/3 of the governors and the presidents all to agree to get rid of it. This will never happen.
Unless you have the national popular vote.
That's
we
right.
got 12 states so far. Just need about, half a dozen more.
That's right. If you have a comment on any topic at any time, just give us a call or give us a tweet at BP Show.
We had Pete Buttigieg, Mayor Pete, was on Morning Joe yesterday morning. He was asked by Willie Geis this question. Again, it doesn't need a complicated answer.
Would you support getting rid of the Electoral College?
Absolutely. It's got to go.
Well, that's all you got to say. Right.
Easy enough.
Get right to it. Colleen, what is the state of higher education in the United States today?
Well,
it's expensive.
It is expensive. I think the thing we probably talk about the most is student loan debt. It's an issue on a lot of not just young people's minds. Increasingly older Americans have student loan debt and are repaying loans while they're going into retirement. It's an issue that the AARP has taken up in recent years.
Really?
And so, I think a lot that we think about.
President Obama, or was it Michelle, one of the two of them, didn't they have a lingering student debt?
Yes. So Michelle Obama actually, too, made higher education one of her big priorities with the Retire initiative. And so, I think that as we see more members of Congress coming in that are on the younger side, that are millennials, they have student loan debt. And so it's becoming an issue that's kind of front of mind for a lot of folks. I think it's also important, though, that we not just talk about affordability of college, but also quality of institutions. We see these big for-profit college chains closing and, executives not being held accountable for those closures. And that's something we have to think about, too.
Well, let's talk about, but I don't want to run away from this debt question. First of all, the amount of debt, I forget what that number is, enormous,
it's
right?
It's $1.5 trillion in outstanding federal student loan debt.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Right. Which is what, second only to home mortgages or something?
Yeah, and that's about 45 million Americans have student loan debt now.
45 million Americans?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right. But that reflects on the fact that there's no way to get into for most of them, right, to get in without taking out a loan.
Yeah, and even at community colleges, which have pretty low tuition prices, really we have to think about the cost of living. And so if a student wants to go full-time, you're looking at paying rent, food, transportation, and especially as we have more books, supplies, all of those things, and especially now as we have more adults going to college and people who have families, they even have more expenses than a traditionally aged college student would have.
Right. So then some people have figured out, well, there's a way to rig the system to get in.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes, definitely.
Which we just learned about last week.
Yeah, and I think that the system's always been rigged toward the wealthy. If we think about things like early admissions and legacy admissions, those favor people who have historically been able to go to college and kind of know how to work the process. And those people tend to be on the higher income side.
So in other words, if you went to a particular school and you have given them a good chunk of money, your kids are going to get into that school.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And I think that, that might not be a complete given, but legacy admissions have a big impact, especially at selective institutions. And even, I came from a pretty low income background. I received Pell Grants when I went to college. And even when I got into my father's alma mater, which is a state school, they were sending him, start your legacy, encourage your daughter to go to this university. So, it's a thing that has been perpetuated by schools for many, many years.
But so that's one thing, right? But then what we learned last week is that there are organizations, institutions, legally, and one of them certainly illegally, who were really rigging the system to get kids in who maybe didn't deserve to get in.
Absolutely.
Right?
And
even having other people take their SAT tests.
Yes. And this is something that I think, there's...
So, guys, my question is, how widespread is that illegal activity, whether it's looking the other way or changing the scores or having other people take the test or coming up with what we learned about phony athletic prowess or something? How widespread is that compared to the legal side, which is just people who act as consultants, starting with when kids are in grade school, basically, about how they're going to get into college?
Yeah, it's been a big business. I think it's hard to kind of put a number on it, but this most recent scandal has really highlighted just how deep some of these schemes go to getting wealthy students into college.
Well, you almost have to conclude that, like I must say, I never heard about this before.
Yeah.
That these kind of these consultants or these companies existed.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And I think most Americans probably don't.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. And what you're seeing there is an industry that crops up because the wealthy really want access to these institutions for their children, realizing how much of a leg up it gives them.
Right. So the poor people who don't know about this or who can't afford this kind of help are just screwed.
Absolutely. And you see, I think people have put this in contrast to affirmative action where, people are really, blaming students of color and lower income students saying, you took my spot or you shouldn't be at this institution, when it really works the other way where, all of these wealthy students are unqualified to be at these institutions are taking the places of lower income students who are very well qualified to be there.
Amen. Look at them. Look at some of these freeloaders and say, you don't belong here. I mean, that one young woman, I think, was from UC, one of the UC campuses, who basically admitted she was just there not to learn, but to play.
Yeah,
right?
She's at the University of Southern California.
Oh, that was it. It was USC. Yeah.
Yep.
Right. So what happens? And were the colleges in on the game?
It's unclear, I think, how deep some of this went at the colleges. Some colleges will say that, well, it wasn't our admissions office. It was just the sports team. And I will say that there is some autonomy at schools related to the athletics programs and kind of who those coaches can recruit and say, yeah, give this student a pass, they're on the team. And so, it's hard to say how deep this went or how far up the kind of chain of the institution it went. But the University of Southern California did just appoint a new president, and I think they're kind of hoping to turn things around.
Right. So is there any effort at all to kind of put some either limits or controls on college tuition, or is it just something that continues to escalate?
So the way that people tend to talk about this is through capping the amount that students can borrow. So we just saw the Trump administration's priorities come out for higher education. One of them is capping the amount of loans graduate students can borrow. But the thing there is that we're talking just about limiting the access to aid that students can receive and access to funds, as opposed to actually capping the price of schools.
Yeah,
which is really what we should be talking about.
Yeah, why does that help? I mean, that's like it seems to me, a car dealer says, okay, the car costs $100,000. We'll give you a loan for $30,000. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, fine. That means you don't owe as much money. It also means you can't buy the car.
Exactly.
Right?
And what happens to students is that they then start to work. They might take part-time jobs or even be working full-time while they're enrolled. It delays completion. And then ultimately, a lot of students don't end up completing because it just takes them so long. You'll see part-time students enrolled for 10 years and still have not completed a degree.
But there are no price controls on college tuition.
That's right.
Correct?
That's right.
Not in the private, not in the public.
Not in the private or the public sector. And, I think we see...
And have they continued to college tuition to go up as...
Yeah, and I think what we see is that...
Fast as it used to, I guess.
And, what we typically see is about, 2 to 4% a year, depending on kind of the economy. What typically ends up happening is that community colleges will, keep their costs lower or try to, make things as affordable as possible for their students. But also, we've seen some efforts from more selective institutions to either freeze their tuition or to guarantee students that, the tuition will not increase from your first year until the year that you leave. So trying to provide some of that price certainty, but really that's only been possible because these schools already have endowments, they're raising money. It's not that states are saying to schools, you need to control your costs. We're going to invest more in you to keep costs down for students.
Right. Don't I recall that under the Obama administration, they made some move to eliminate the middleman in some of these student loans. Right? Do I
yes.
get that right?
So we saved a lot of money that ended up going into the Pell Grant program, which is a grant program for low-income students. And so basically in 2010, we went from having about 40% of student loans being made by banks. And, kind of they agreed to follow federal terms. And now we're in a system that we call direct lending. So right now, all students can go to their school, say, I would like to borrow my student loan, and the school creates the loan, disperses the money to the student, and the student then pays it back to the federal government.
So you get that middleman out of the way.
Exactly.
And more goes directly to the loan and not...
Exactly. And we're not paying, billions of dollars a year to these banks that had to be really heavily subsidized in order to take on the management of these federal student loans.
All right. So what is your advice to parents like Ray here with a young child?
Yeah.
And Peter with two that are not babies, but pretty soon are going to be looking at colleges.
Yeah.
Right?
I've got a kid going into high school next year. They've already started visits to colleges.
Right. What is your advice to young parents today about facing? It comes pretty fast, right?
It absolutely does.
You got to face that course about where your kids are going to go to school.
Yeah, absolutely. And
how can they prepare for it?
There's this. I think when my friends have children and they think about, I need to save $500,000 to send my kid to college.
Yeah, no, right.
And I don't think that's really something that we can continue to push forward with this. You just have to save and kind of figure it out. I think that higher education needs to become a voters issue, that it needs to be something that people really think about critically when they're looking at a candidate and not just looking at, healthcare, foreign policy, but also what are they going to do about the cost of college and how are they going to make it more affordable for everyone?
Well, that gets us to seriously, we do not talk about education as much as we used to. I remember what was much more of in the political realm, an issue the candidates talked about all the time. Yeah. But to the extent that it's talked about today, Bernie Sanders is out in front on tuition-free college, making the argument that we went from tuition-free grade school to tuition-free high school, and now this is the logical next step. It's either tuition-free or debt-free college. Where are we going? And is it within the realm of possibility?
I think that we have to consider kind of how much these proposals will cost, which, of course, they're very, very expensive. But also I think that,
we're talking probably community colleges here, right? Or state universities.
Typically, it's related to.
We're not talking about Harvard and Yale.
It's only related to public institutions. There are some debt-free plans that kind of require private institutions to put up their funds in order to kind of supplement these either free or debt-free plans. So, the distinction between free and debt-free is that free college is typically defined as tuition and fees are provided without cost to the student, and then they kind of have to figure out their living expenses. With debt-free, the promise is that, more based on your family income, you will not be required to borrow student loans in order to finance the entire cost of your education. So when we look at free versus debt-free, typically, the way that people think about these things is that debt-free tends to be a little bit more progressive because you have higher income people paying some of the cost of college instead of fully subsidizing their tuition. And this is, we haven't seen debt-free models be implemented anywhere. A few different states have, I'll say, free community college or tuition-free programs. But, some of the challenges of those programs is that in order to save money, what they do is they apply students grant aid first. So if you get a Pell Grant, that money gets applied to your tuition first, and then the state will fill in the rest. The challenge there, though, is you're left without grant aid to live. And if you're a low-income student, living costs, are in excess of $10,000 a year. So you have to kind of figure out how to make up that gap, and that can be really challenging.
Didn't California once have tuition-free University of California?
Yeah. So California's kind of evolved over time. And currently, most students in the community college system go tuition-free. and they're eligible for, to have either a federal Pell Grant and some Cal grants, state grants on top of that in order for them to pay for those living expenses.
Okay.
But as you know, California is very expensive.
Well, so now let's get to Betsy DeVos. Is she the worst education secretary we've ever had?
I haven't looked back at the entire history of education secretaries, but I definitely think that
she'd be up in the top.
She would probably be in the top 5.
I mean, on many different fronts, right?
Yeah, I think we have to also consider the people around her that, she seems to be pretty myopic in her focus. And there's folks around her who also have some designs on cutting students out of higher education.
Yes. And also, her focus and her fortune has been spent more on private college, or not?
Yes.
Or what? No.
Private schooling, and so she's really about school choice for students who are in grade school and high school, and allowing families to kind of make that decision. But typically, what that means is that there's less investment in public schools. And when you have wealthy people, especially, kind of moving their money around to these private institutions and not kind of supporting public schools, then we end up in a situation where, we have very two separate and unequal sectors.
What is the latest on the for-profit universities?
They're still
I remember
raring.
the great Senator Tom Harkin from Iowa. This was his big issue.
Yeah,
right?
And there's there's folks who are still fighting to make sure that for-profit colleges are held accountable to, providing their students with good outcomes. Unfortunately, Betsy DeVos has been attempting to roll back as many regulations as possible on for-profit colleges. A court actually just overturned an illegal delay of some rules related to for-profit schools. So that's good. Those will take effect and have to be enforced by the Department of Education while they attempt to re-regulate. But the challenge here now is that, when we see these budget requests and as we go forward thinking about reauthorizing the Higher Education Act, which, is really the biggest law that governs all of higher education in this country, we end up seeing essentially that Republicans and conservatives are trying to open up the floodgates to more funding for these schools.
Are they surviving?
So
some of them have gone out of business.
Some very large
not
chains.
To mention Trump University.
Yeah, which is one of those kind of programs that would actually be kind of let into some of the federal financial aid programs under some of these new initiatives. And so, we've seen schools like ITT Tech, which was a national chain, go under. And now we're seeing Argosy University closing, which is also a large for-profit chain. And the Department of Education is really having to try to figure out what to do. And it leaves tens of thousands of students in a situation where they have a lot of credits, they might be close to graduating, and all of a sudden, either if they stay, their degree means nothing, or if they leave, they have a lot of debt and nothing to do with the credits that they earned.
Right. And if they go under, right, you're just left high and dry if you're a student there or a faculty member or whatever.
The Obama administration put together some rules called borrower defense to repayment that essentially said that, if your school closes, if you're able to transfer your credits, then, you can keep your debt and finish your degree somewhere else. But if you choose to not, then we'll forgive your federal student loan debt.
Yeah. So
Betsy DeVos has tried to put an end to those regulations and has delayed paying students, forgiving their loans. But that's also kind of going through the courts.
It's very, very, very important. And it's great that the Center for American Progress is devoting so much attention to this. So thank you for what you're doing. Thanks for coming in today.
I appreciate
Keep up the good work.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Michael Shields, John Koza, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.